Jacksonville in the summer of 1949 had a slow, almost languid rhythm. The kind of place where neighbors knew one another's business, but not always the secrets that festered beneath neatly trimmed lawns. The streets were lined with brick homes, white picket fences, and the occasional elm tree that cast long shadows in the late afternoon sun. Shopkeepers swept their sidewalks. Children played stickball in dusty alleys, and the hum of traffic along Main Street was punctuated by the occasional whistle of a passing train. On the surface, it was a picture of small-town America, peaceful, ordinary, and unremarkable. But beneath that calm, Jacksonville held stories that no one wanted to tell, and one of those stories was about to erupt, leaving the community stunned for decades to come. Evelyn Parker was 16 years old the summer she vanished. She was tall for her age, with chestnut hair that fell in loose waves to her shoulders, freckles dusting the bridge of her nose, and sharp hazel eyes that seemed to notice everything around her. People who knew her described her as bright, curious, and headstrong, a girl with a laugh that could fill a room and a determination that sometimes exasperated her teachers. She had dreams of becoming a journalist, scribbling stories into a worn notebook she carried everywhere, chronicling the mundane and the extraordinary alike. On the morning of June 14th, 1949, Evelyn had risen early, as she often did, to deliver newspapers along her route before school. She wore a pale yellow dress, sneakers scuffed from weeks of summer activity, and a ribbon tied neatly in her hair. Her father, Thomas Parker, a local postal worker, had reminded her to be careful on the streets, and her mother, Margaret, had fussed over her hair for a few extra minutes. "Be back by lunchtime," Margaret had called, adjusting Evelyn's ribbon. "And don't talk to strangers." Evelyn had smiled, kissed her mother on the cheek, and walked out the door, unaware that this ordinary morning would become the last anyone would see her alive. The route was familiar. Evelyn waved to neighbors, dropped newspapers on doorsteps, and occasionally stopped to chat with Mrs. Donnelly, who always offered a piece of peppermint candy. By all accounts, she was cheerful, methodical, and completely untroubled. But by the time she reached the corner near the old cotton mill, something or someone interrupted the flow of her day. Witnesses would later describe a man lingering near the edge of the lot, tall and unremarkable in appearance, but with a presence that made the hair on their arms rise. Evelyn, curious and fearless, had approached to ask if he needed directions or help. That moment, fleeting as it seemed, marked the beginning of a nightmare that would span decades. Hours passed with no sign of Evelyn returning home. By mid-afternoon, Margaret Parker had begun to worry. She called the neighbors, checking to see if anyone had seen her daughter. Her anxiety grew when the school confirmed that Evelyn had not arrived. Thomas returned home from his postal route, noticing his wife's pallor and the tightening of her hands around the kitchen table. "She's just late," he reassured her, though his voice carried an unspoken doubt. Calls were made, searches begun, but as evening fell, the realization sank in: Evelyn Parker was missing. The local police were notified immediately. Officer Harold Green, a veteran of 20 years with the Jacksonville Police Department, led the initial investigation. Green knew the town well. He knew its residents, its alleys, its hidden nooks where children sometimes played unsupervised. But even he, with all his experience, felt the prickling unease of a case that did not fit the usual pattern. Missing children often wandered off to stay with friends or distant relatives, or occasionally ran away from strict households. But Evelyn Parker was different. She was responsible, loved, and thoroughly grounded in her family's care. Her disappearance was not an ordinary misadventure. The first searches focused on familiar routes: the newspaper delivery path, the local park, and the wooded edges near the cotton mill. Volunteers, neighbors, and friends combed the streets and fields, calling her name into the wind, their voices bouncing off brick walls and rustling leaves. By nightfall, the town square buzzed with anxious whispers. Posters with Evelyn's photograph were hastily printed and taped to lampposts. The image captured her hazel eyes and soft smile, frozen in the innocence of youth, a haunting reminder of what had been lost. As darkness settled over Jacksonville, a knot of fear tightened in the chest of every resident. Stories began circulating. Strangers seen lurking near the edges of town, unfamiliar cars parked where they did not belong, and rumors of a local man who had been acting strangely in the days prior. These whispers spread quickly, as small towns are prone to do, each retelling amplifying the sense of unease. Yet no one could yet piece together what had truly happened to Evelyn Parker, and the investigation was only beginning to scratch the surface of a secret that had remained hidden for years. The Parker family, grief-stricken and desperate, clung to hope. Margaret refused to go to bed that first night, sitting by the phone in case someone had information. Thomas drove through the neighborhoods repeatedly, scanning darkened streets, murmuring Evelyn's name into the silence. Friends and neighbors offered comfort, but the underlying tension was palpable. The town had entered a liminal space, caught between normalcy and catastrophe, the familiar and the incomprehensible. Every ticking hour deepened the fear that something unspeakable had occurred. By the second day, Officer Green had called for reinforcements. Sheriff Raymond Ellis in the county office arrived with additional deputies, bringing bloodhounds, lanterns, and an organized search plan. They scoured the mill, the nearby woods, and even the shallow banks of the St. Johns River. Despite their exhaustive efforts, no trace of Evelyn emerged. Green, standing near the edge of the cotton mill at dusk, whispered a quiet prayer he didn't fully believe. God help us find her. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth, but nothing else. No footprints, no discarded belongings, nothing to indicate where the girl had gone. In the following days, false leads emerged. A traveling salesman claimed to have seen a girl matching Evelyn's description at a roadside diner, but interviews proved the timeline impossible. Another tip suggested a factory worker had offered her a ride home, but he was quickly cleared. Each lead raised hopes, only to dash them against the stubborn reality of silence. The town's anxiety morphed into collective fear. Every stranger passing through, every unfamiliar face in the market, drew suspicion. Children were kept indoors, parents scolded overly cautious warnings, and Jacksonville felt simultaneously smaller and more treacherous than it ever had before. And yet, even in the shadow of despair, small acts of courage emerged. Teenagers organized search parties, wading into streams and climbing the low hills, shouting Evelyn's name. Local women cooked meals for exhausted officers, carrying pots of stew and loaves of bread through the humid streets. Clergy organized prayer vigils at the church, candles flickering in the evening breeze. The soft chorus of voices singing in unison for a girl whose presence still lingered in their hearts. For the Parker family, these gestures were bittersweet, a mixture of gratitude for communal support and sharp pain for the daughter they had lost. As the first week passed with no concrete leads, the case began to attract wider attention. Newspapers in nearby cities published photographs, described the town's fear, and interviewed neighbors. A sense of urgency permeated the reporting. A young girl had vanished without explanation, and authorities seemed no closer to solving the puzzle. For Jacksonville, this was no longer a private tragedy. It had become a story that drew outsiders, and the pressure on law enforcement intensified. Green and Ellis faced scrutiny, accusations, and a heavy burden of responsibility, all while privately questioning how a child could disappear so completely in a town that prided itself on safety and familiarity. Amid the chaos, one detail emerged that would later prove critical. A neighbor reported seeing a figure carrying a large bundle toward the old railroad tracks late in the afternoon of June 14th. The description was vague, a tall man, unremarkable in clothing, moving quickly, but it offered the first thread of a narrative that would unravel slowly, painfully, and with shocking consequences. At the time, officers noted it down, but the lack of corroborating evidence meant the tip was treated cautiously, a small glimmer in a sea of uncertainty. The first chapter of Evelyn Parker's disappearance closed with Jacksonville holding its breath, a town suspended between hope and fear. Parents hugged their children tightly. Shopkeepers double-checked locks, and every passerby on Main Street felt the unseen weight of the story that had begun on an ordinary summer morning, and now threatened to haunt the community for decades. Little did anyone know. The truth was out there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the passage of time, the evolution of investigative techniques, and the courage of those who would not forget. The days following Evelyn Parker's disappearance blurred together in a haze of worry, suspicion, and relentless searching. Jacksonville's residents woke each morning to the same grim question. Where was she? Every sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant whistle of a train, the bark of a dog, set nerves on edge. Parents huddled their children close, muttering warnings about strangers. Even streets that had once felt safe now seemed unfamiliar. Every alley a potential threat. Every shadow a hiding place. The town had shifted. The ordinary rhythms of life had been replaced by a quiet, simmering tension that no one could ignore. The Parker household became the epicenter of grief and urgency. Margaret Parker refused to sit idle, moving from room to room with a kind of restless determination. She called neighbors repeatedly, checked every nearby store, and questioned anyone who might have had contact with Evelyn in the days leading up to her disappearance. Thomas, though stoic, poured himself into the practical work of searching, revisiting the delivery route, examining the trails near the cotton mill, and trying, often in vain, to piece together what had happened. Friends and relatives arrived, offering both comfort and manpower, but the absence of concrete answers gnawed at everyone involved. Local law enforcement expanded the investigation, calling in additional officers from neighboring counties. They set up checkpoints along major roads, interviewed local business owners, and checked with train stations and bus depots. Sheriff Raymond Ellis was methodical and careful, determined not to jump conclusions, but the clock was ticking. With each passing day, the urgency mounted. Green and Ellis reviewed the reports repeatedly, comparing witness statements, looking for inconsistencies, and attempting to construct a timeline from fragments of memory. Meanwhile, Jacksonville's tight-knit community began to fracture under the weight of fear. Rumors spread like wildfire. Some claimed Evelyn had been seen with a man in a dark suit. Others said she had simply run away from home. But those who knew her best, including friends at school and family members, were adamant she would never have left voluntarily. Her life, though typical for a teenager, was filled with routines, responsibilities, and a deep attachment to her family. The idea that she had vanished by choice seemed impossible. Yet the absence of evidence left the community grasping for any explanation. School corridors became spaces of hushed conversations and whispered fears. Evelyn's friends were inconsolable, some refusing to attend classes, others sneaking into empty hallways to speak privately about what might have happened. Teachers tried to maintain normalcy, but their own anxieties often betrayed them. They reassured students that the police were working tirelessly, yet the look in their eyes told a different story. A recognition that Jacksonville's innocence had been shaken, and nothing would be the same again. Search parties continued through the first week. Volunteers waded through creeks and streams, climbed into the thick underbrush of surrounding woods, and checked every abandoned building in the vicinity. They shouted Evelyn's name until their voices were raw, leaving echoes that seemed to hang in the humid summer air. Dogs were brought in to track scents, though the passage of time and the heat of the day complicated their efforts. Officers noted patterns. Some areas were searched multiple times with no result, and sightings that initially seemed promising often proved false. The growing desperation began to permeate every aspect of the investigation. Local newspapers chronicled the story with increasing urgency. Front-page headlines proclaimed Jacksonville girl missing, search intensifies, and community in shock over disappearance. Journalists interviewed neighbors and local officials, painting vivid pictures of a town gripped by fear and uncertainty. Photos of Evelyn, her hazel eyes bright and inquisitive, were printed repeatedly. Every new report generated both hope and anxiety. Families across Jacksonville and nearby towns followed each update obsessively, their imaginations filled with worst-case scenarios. Telephone lines were constantly busy, with tips flooding into the police station. Some were promising, some confusing, and others cruel or misinformed. One woman called claiming she had seen a girl matching Evelyn's description in a small diner 20 miles north, though follow-up revealed she had mistaken a teenager for Evelyn. A local handyman insisted he had noticed a suspicious man near the railroad tracks, carry what looked like a large bundle, but nothing concrete emerged from that lead either. Officers filed each tip carefully, hoping that even the faintest thread might lead to truth, but days passed with frustration mounting. The Parker family's anguish became a focal point for the town. Margaret, often trembling, sat in the living room with photographs of Evelyn spread before her, tracing her daughter's features with trembling hand. She recalled the smallest details, the way Evelyn would laugh at jokes only she found funny, the scuff on her sneaker from last week's newspaper route, the ribbon she had tied that morning with meticulous care. Thomas spent long hours outside, walking the paths Evelyn had taken, replaying every memory in his mind, trying to find something, anything he might have missed. Friends and neighbors brought casseroles, offered spare rooms for volunteers, and stayed up late into the night discussing possible leads. The Parker household, once a center of quiet domesticity, had transformed into a command post of grief, hope, and determination. The first week also brought the involvement of state authorities. The Florida Bureau of Investigation dispatched agents to assist with the search, bringing more resources, bloodhounds, and additional manpower. They began to systematically document the town, mapping out every alley, street, and wooded area. Interview protocols were refined, witness statements were cross-checked, and each tip was subjected to careful scrutiny. The atmosphere in Jacksonville grew tense. Officers and agents moved methodically, their presence a constant reminder that this was no longer a simple missing person case, but potential abduction with serious implications. Despite these efforts, Jacksonville citizens felt the creeping despair of uncertainty. Evening air, once warm and soothing, now carried a sense of foreboding. Windows were closed tightly, and children were called inside long before sunset. Neighbors spoke quietly on porches, speculating about strangers in town and wondering how a child could vanish without a trace. Fear became a social currency, shaping conversations, interactions, and even behavior of those who had once been indifferent to routines of daily life. By the second week, Jacksonville's local radio stations began broadcasting public appeals. Messages from a Parker family were delivered over the airwaves, pleading for any information. Evelyn's photograph was displayed on flyers, posters, and bulletin boards, ensuring that her face was known to anyone passing through. The combination of radio, print, and personal canvassing created a network of vigilance, but no matter how widespread the warnings, Evelyn's trail remained elusive. During these first crucial days, Officer Green made a discovery that would later become significant. He reviewed the small assortment of items Evelyn carried on her newspaper route, a satchel, a notebook, and her wallet, and noted the absence of struggle marks on her home's exterior, suggesting that she had not been forcibly taken from the Parker residence. This implied that whoever had taken her may have lured her or intercepted her during her route. It was a subtle, chilling realization. The abductor had likely observed her routines, understood her habits, and acted with patience and precision. The implication unsettled Green deeply. The familiar, sleepy streets of Jacksonville had become a stage for deliberate and calculated cruelty. By the third week, exhaustion was setting in among searchers and investigators alike. Volunteers arrived each morning with renewed determination, yet the oppressive summer heat and relentless terrain wore them down. Officers worked in shifts, often losing track of hours, driven only by the urgency of finding Evelyn. Local businesses contributed refreshments and shaded areas for rest, while churches organized prayer circles to sustain morale. The town itself had transformed into a community-wide operation, united by fear, grief, and hope, but the question lingered. Could they find her before it was too late? Rumors continued to circulate, some rooted in observation, others in gossip. A traveling repairman claimed to have seen a young girl matching Evelyn's description near the outskirts of town late in the afternoon on June 14th. Though his account was vague and lacked supporting evidence. Some speculated about drifters passing through Jacksonville, and whispers of organized crime or human trafficking began to surface, though authorities quickly noted these were unlikely for the town at that time. Still, the speculation underscored a pervasive anxiety. In the absence of answers, fear multiplies, and imagination can become as potent as reality. By the end of the month, Jacksonville had entered a state of suspended alarm. The Parker family continued their tireless search, aided by the police and volunteers, while the town grappled with the unsettling reality that a young girl had vanished without explanation. Officers Green and Ellis, though methodical and careful, began to feel the pressure of public scrutiny and the creeping dread that cases like this, if unresolved, could haunt a community for generations. Somewhere within the shadows of streets, fields, and forests lay the truth about Evelyn Parker, a truth that will remain hidden for decades, waiting for the moment when forensic insight, chance, and persistence would finally reveal it. The Parker family's grief deepened as Jacksonville collectively absorbed the weight of Evelyn's disappearance. Margaret Parker's days blurred into nights, Her hands often trembling as she traced her daughter's face in photographs, whispered her name into the silent house, and replayed every ordinary moment of the morning she vanished. Each memory carried a sharp edge. Evelyn's laughter at breakfast, the brushing of her hair, the kiss she left on her mother's cheek. These fragments became both a lifeline and a source of unbearable pain. Thomas Parker, stoic and determined, tried to anchor his family, but in the quiet hours of the evening, he too felt the hollow ache of helplessness. He wandered the streets alone sometimes, flashlight in hand, repeating Evelyn's route in hopes of glimpsing something, anything, that might provide a clue. Neighbors and friends rallied to the Parker household, offering support in every form imaginable. Dinners were brought daily, volunteers helped clean and organize the house, and friends stayed late into the night, talking to Margaret to keep her company. Some whispered theories among themselves. Perhaps Evelyn had wandered off, they said, or maybe a stranger had passed through town. But those who knew her best, teachers, classmates, and close friends, were unanimous. Evelyn would never have left voluntarily. Her sense of responsibility, her attachment to family, and her steady nature made the idea of running away implausible. Their certainty only amplified the desperation of those who refused to believe in the worst-case scenario. The wider community became involved in ways both organized and instinctive. Church groups organized prayer vigils in the evenings, filling the sanctuary with candlelight and hushed voices, the scent of wax and summer air blending into a solemn offering. Local merchants offered free printing of posters, distributing them to townsfolk and posting them in shop windows. Children were kept indoors after school, and parents drove their routines with a heightened wariness, their eyes constantly scanning unfamiliar faces, their minds imagining every possibility. Every sighting of a stranger or unfamiliar car brought tension. Every minor anomaly whispered of danger. Jacksonville was gripped by a quiet, pervasive fear that altered its rhythm, and every resident felt the invisible tug of vigilance pressing against their daily lives. Evelyn's classmates played a unique role in keeping her presence alive. At school, hallways were filled with whispers about her disappearance, classmates organizing search parties during breaks, and some sneaking into empty classrooms to huddle and share theories. Teachers, caught between maintaining order and addressing the collective anxiety, did their best to guide students, but the look in their eyes betrayed their own unease. The disappearance of a child, even one who was a teenager, was not just a personal tragedy. It was a fracture in perception of the town's safety, a crack in the very foundation of community trust. As days turned into weeks, the media arrived, bringing cameras, notebooks, and a lens that magnified every fear. Local and regional newspapers carried the story with somber detail, interviewing neighbors, officials, and relatives, documenting the panic and desperation that had overtaken Jacksonville. Headlines proclaimed, "Town in shock, teenager missing," and search for Evelyn Parker intensifies. Each new article spread awareness, but also amplified anxiety. Letters arrived from strangers offering assistance, tips, or condolences, though most were either irrelevant or unverifiable. The Parker family read each one, weighing hope against despair, feeling the strain of processing every shred of information with careful attention and mounting exhaustion. The involvement of civic organizations brought structure to the frantic search. Rotary clubs, local youth groups, and volunteer brigades coordinated patrols and door-to-door inquiries. Maps were marked with areas already searched, and logs were kept meticulously to prevent duplication of effort. Officers instructed volunteers on basic safety and observation techniques, emphasizing the importance of noting even seemingly trivial details. The town became an intricate web of vigilance, where every person, knowingly or not, participated in the collective effort to find Evelyn. Yet the weight of expectation bore heavily on the Parker family. Margaret's sleep was fragmented. She often rose in the night to walk the house or peer out the window at the quiet streets. Thomas carried the invisible load of responsibility, feeling guilt that he had not accompanied Evelyn on her route or observed the early warning signs he now imagined were there. The psychological toll was relentless. Small victories, an unconfirmed sighting, a misplaced glove, a fleeting lead, were bittersweet, offering only temporary relief before plunging the family back into the void of uncertainty. The community's collective anxiety manifested in subtle social shifts. Gossip thrived. Every passerby became suspect. Every new face an object of scrutiny. People closed doors earlier. Children were summoned home from outdoor play at odd hours. And neighbors who once trusted one another implicitly began to question every unexplained absence. Jacksonville, once a town of routine comfort, had been remade by fear and grief. Its social fabric stretched thin, but held together by a fragile determination to protect what remained. Despite the fear, acts of courage and kindness continued to shine. Teenagers mapped out routes, wading into streams and climbing hills to search areas overlooked by officers. Shopkeepers and clerks opened their stores after hours to provide shelter and refreshments for volunteers. Clergy visited the Parker household daily, offering prayers, counsel, and companionship. The town had discovered a collective strength it did not know it possessed, an instinctive response to crisis that bound strangers together in a shared mission. During community meetings organized by the city council, tension mingled with determination. Citizens asked questions, demanded updates, and pressed officials for answers. The Parker family attended, sometimes trembling with emotion, often barely able to speak, but present in every sense. These gatherings allowed residents to voice fears, propose theories, and offer assistance. They were also an unintentional forum for speculation, where rumors, some plausible, some far-fetched, circulated freely. Still, the meetings reinforced a sense of shared responsibility, a recognition that finding Evelyn was not solely a police matter, but a mission for every resident of Jacksonville. Meanwhile, whispers of potential suspects began to circulate, fueled by observation and fear rather than evidence. A traveling salesman who had been seen in town days prior became the subject of intense scrutiny, though investigators quickly determined he had a solid alibi. Another neighbor, known for odd behavior, faced suspicion and intrusive questioning. Each accusation, while often baseless, reflected the town's growing inability to separate fear from fact. Jacksonville had become a crucible, refining collective anxiety into a tense, watchful awareness that permeated every household. Letters and phone calls to the police department continued, some helpful, many mistaken, and a few intentionally misleading. Officers Green and Ellis meticulously recorded each tip, though resources were stretched thin. They understood that within the noise of rumor and error might lie the single, crucial piece of information that would break the case wide open. Every detail mattered. An overlooked footprint, a fleeting glance, a forgotten conversation. It was a painstaking, exhausting process, but one they pursued with dogged resolve. By the fourth week, Jacksonville's social landscape had transformed. Streets were quieter as children were kept close. Stores reported fewer casual visitors, and families huddled at home in the evenings, listening for any indication of Evelyn's return. The Parker household, once a place of ordinary family life, had become a symbol of perseverance and vulnerability. Friends and neighbors continued to visit, alternating between providing solace and absorbing the emotional weight of the crisis themselves. Through all of this, Margaret Parker maintained a delicate balance between hope and despair. She refused to give up, holding vigil in the evenings with candlelight and photographs, speaking softly to Evelyn as though her words might reach beyond the impossible distance that now separated them. Thomas, too, endured, supported his wife while channeling his frustration and helplessness into organized searching, meticulous record-keeping, and endless phone calls to authorities. Their resilience became a beacon for the community, a reminder that even in the face of uncertainty, the human spirit can sustain itself through courage, love, and sheer determination. As the month drew to a close, Jacksonville had been irrevocably changed. Every resident carried a sense of unease, a heightened vigilance, and a recognition that safety could no longer be taken for granted. Yet, alongside the fear, there emerged a quiet pride in collective effort, a testament to the town's willingness to confront tragedy head-on. In basements, kitchens, and church halls, strategies were devised, search parties coordinated, and hope maintained. The community had found purpose in its shared anxiety, channeling grief into action, and ensuring that Evelyn Parker's absence would not go unnoticed, unremembered, or uninvestigated. Even as frustration mounted over the lack of leads, one truth remained undeniable. Jacksonville would not rest until Evelyn was found. Families clung to their routines. Volunteers scoured the landscape, and officers Green and Ellis persisted with dogged attention to detail. The seeds of determination, hope, and resilience planted in these first weeks would sustain the town through decades of uncertainty, until the day when new evidence, old memories, and unrelenting resolve would finally uncover the truth. As Jacksonville settled into a rhythm of anxious searching, the investigation took on a life of its own, moving beyond neighborhood streets and prayer vigils into the meticulous world of detective work. Officer Harold Green and Sheriff Raymond Ellis now faced the daunting task of transforming a chaotic flood of tips, rumors, and fleeting sightings into a coherent strategy capable of uncovering the truth. Each day brought new leads, some promising, others dead ends, and each required careful attention, lest a critical clue slipped through the cracks. The first formal interviews centered on Evelyn's immediate circle. Friends at school were questioned repeatedly, asked to recount their last interactions with her, to remember any unusual encounters, to provide every detail, no matter how trivial, about her routines. Most reported nothing out of the ordinary, their memories of breakfast conversations, shared walks to the newspaper route, and whispered jokes at lockers providing little insight into the girl's disappearance. Yet, patterns began to emerge. Small inconsistencies in timing, vague recollections of seeing strangers on the streets, and the faintest recollections of an unknown man near the cotton mill on that fateful morning. Green documented everything meticulously, knowing that even minor discrepancies could later become pivotal. Investigators extended their reach, canvassing every adult male in proximity to Evelyn's route. Attention fell on men with criminal records, those who had been noted for suspicious behavior, and anyone who had been seen loitering near the delivery path. One man, a local drifter named Walter Higgins, drew scrutiny when a witness claimed she had seen him speaking with a girl resembling Evelyn in a diner 3 towns over. Higgins, however, provided a solid alibi. He had been working on a farm 50 miles away, corroborated by multiple employees. Though cleared, the suspicion lingered in the community, fueled by fear and uncertainty. The search also extended to Jacksonville's peripheries, the woods behind Cotton Mill, the banks of the St. Johns River, abandoned railroad tracks, and industrial lots. Officers combed these areas methodically, marking grids and noting every piece of debris, discarded clothing or footprint. Bloodhounds traced faint scents that led to dead ends. A torn shoe in the underbrush, a satchel snagged on a fence, a fleeting smell of cigarette smoke that evaporated before it could be pinned to any individual. Each find promised hope, only to dissolve into frustration, underscoring the difficulty of piecing together a narrative from fragments of a vanished life. Rumors continued to dominate public discourse. A visiting salesman claimed he had seen a girl resembling Evelyn on a bus heading south, prompting a brief interstate search. Local teenagers whispered about strangers in town who had lingered near the cotton mill and railroad tracks in the days preceding her disappearance. An itinerant repairman reported spotting a man carrying what looked like a large bundle late in the afternoon on June 14th. Investigators carefully evaluated each report, aware that while most were coincidental or false, any could hold a kernel of truth. The sheer volume of information made distinguishing reality from rumor a painstaking process. The media's role became more pronounced during this phase. Regional newspapers, drawn to the story's intrigue, published speculative accounts alongside verified reports. Headlines oscillated between hope and horror. Local girl missing. Search intensifies, and was she taken? Readers pored over each line, offering tips to police or discussing possibilities in social gatherings. For some, the media coverage amplified fear. For others, it motivated involvement in the search. Officers Green and Ellis navigated the dual pressures of community expectation and investigative prudence, striving to maintain control in an environment increasingly colored by speculation. Despite the attention, concrete evidence remained elusive. Early efforts focused on supposed sightings along Evelyn's route, but nothing substantiated the claims. Investigators conducted house-to-house interviews, often revisiting residents multiple times to confirm details, yet the answers consistently returned to the same grim reality. No one had definitively seen her after the morning of June 14th. Small inconsistencies, like a slightly shifted window curtain or an unfamiliar footprint near the cotton mill, were noted but ultimately proved inconsequential in isolation. The investigation was a web of near misses, fleeting clues, and false hope. One promising lead emerged when a local farmer reported finding a broken strap from a satchel near a drainage ditch adjacent to his property. Green examined the item and noted it matched the description of Evelyn's newspaper bag. Officers and volunteers scoured the surrounding area, marking a potential search zone that stretched for miles. Yet, despite an exhaustive effort, no additional items or traces of Evelyn were discovered. The broken strap became a haunting symbol of proximity without revelation, evidence that tantalized without delivering answers. Further complicating the investigation were the social dynamics of Jacksonville itself. In a town where everyone knew one another, suspicion could easily inflame tensions. Neighbors who had once shared friendly conversation now exchanged wary glances. Local men found themselves scrutinized for innocuous behavior. Family disputes over volunteering priorities and search strategies occasionally boiled over. Officers Green and Ellis had to navigate not only the logistics of the investigation, but also the fragile social fabric of a community teetering between fear, grief, and determination. False suspects emerged regularly, each bringing renewed hope and inevitable disappointment. One man, Henry Calloway, was detained after several witnesses claimed he had been seen near the cotton mill acting suspiciously. Calloway's history of minor thefts painted him as potentially dangerous, and while his nervous behavior during questioning drew attention, alibis and corroborating witnesses cleared him of involvement. Nevertheless, the brief detention fueled conversations and speculation in Jacksonville's cafes, general stores, and porches, the community grasping for a tangible target in a case defined by absence and mystery. By late summer, fatigue was becoming apparent among both investigators and residents. The relentless search had tested endurance, patience, and emotional resilience. Green and Ellis organized shifts and rotations to maintain focus, understanding that the human cost of long, fruitless searches could be as damaging as the physical search itself. Volunteers continued to patrol streets and woods, driven by loyalty to the Parker family and a sense of moral duty. But even the most committed began to acknowledge the possibility that the answers might not come quickly or at all. Amid the exhaustion, a glimmer of hope persisted. Investigators began compiling the minutiae, witness statements, search logs, observations about a route and behavioral patterns. The aim was to create a comprehensive profile of the disappearance, one that could later be cross-referenced as new evidence emerged. Every detail was preserved with care. The time she left home, the conversation she had on route, the object she carried, and even the weather conditions that morning. While these notes offered no immediate resolution, they formed the foundation for the eventual breakthrough that decades later would crack the case wide open. By the end of the investigation's first phase, Jacksonville had entered a strange liminal state. The community had done everything it could to locate Evelyn, yet the results were painfully minimal. Officers Green and Ellis, though methodical, were confronted with the limitations of 1949 investigative techniques. Without modern forensic tools, DNA analysis, or digital records, they relied heavily on eyewitness accounts, physical searches, and meticulous record-keeping. The case became an exercise in patience, endurance, and the understanding that time itself could sometimes obscure truth as easily as it revealed it. Still, the small victories, finding the broken strap, identifying patterns in witness accounts, and maintaining the cohesion of volunteers and community members, kept hope alive. Jacksonville remained vigilant, determined, and painfully aware that the girl they sought could be just beyond their reach, hidden in a place they had yet to explore. The fear of the unknown had become intertwined with the resolve to act, creating a tense, watchful town where every detail mattered, every shadow was suspect, and every day held both despair and the faint promise of revelation. Months turned into years, and Jacksonville settled into a reluctant acceptance. Evelyn Parker was gone, and the case that had once galvanized the entire town had grown cold. Officer Harold Green, now gray at the temples but still meticulous in approach, reviewed his notes obsessively. He had compiled hundreds of pages of statements, maps, and search logs, each a painstaking record of the efforts to find Evelyn. Yet despite these exhaustive efforts, the trail had run cold, leaving only fragments of memory, faint impressions, and a community haunted by absence. The physical evidence had been scant from the outset. A broken strap from Evelyn's newspaper bag, a scuffed sneaker found near the cotton mill, and a few fleeting footprints. None of these items could definitively point to a suspect. Forensic methods of the late 1940s were rudimentary by modern standards. Fingerprints were cross-checked manually. Footprints were photographed and measured, and every physical clue was stored carefully in the hope that one day, a technological advancement or a fresh pair of eyes might bring clarity. Yet, as decades passed, the case languished, preserved in filing cabinets and fading photographs, like a wound that refused to heal. The Parker family bore the longest burden. Margaret Parker grew older, her hair silvering, her eyes forever searching for a daughter who might never return. She continued to follow up with authorities, attending community vigils and occasionally speaking to journalists, but the hope that had burned so brightly in 1949 dimmed to a quiet, aching memory. Thomas Parker retired from the Postal Service, but continued to visit the same streets, tracing Evelyn's old routes with the same painstaking attention to detail. Their grief became a fixture at Jacksonville, a persistent reminder that loss, when unresolved, could shape generations. Despite the stagnation, small threads of evidence were preserved. Green and Ellis had cataloged everything, understanding instinctively that even the most mundane details could become crucial years later. Notebooks listing witness statements, photographs of search grids, diagrams of the cotton mill property, and careful sketches of the footprints and broken strap remain intact. Occasionally, retired officers or local historians would pore over these materials, hoping that forgotten detail or overlooked pattern might spark a breakthrough. But for decades, the files remained dormant, their significance waiting silently beneath layers of dust and neglect. The community adapted to the void left by Evelyn's disappearance. New families moved in. Children grew up under the lingering shadow of her absence, and the town's sense of security was forever altered. Yet the memory persisted. Posters in attic boxes, photographs in faded albums, and whispered recollections among residents ensured that Evelyn Parker's story was not forgotten. Even as years passed, the collective consciousness of Jacksonville retained the sense that this was a wound unfinished, a narrative awaiting resolution. As the 1960s dawned, attention to the case waned publicly, though Green and Ellis continued to review evidence quietly. The broken strap, in particular, remained a focus. They cataloged its fibers, measured its stitching, and noted every minute detail, convinced that its significance might only emerge under different circumstances. Similarly, the scuffed sneaker and the scattered footprints were preserved, with a hope that someone with new forensic insight could, decades later, provide the clarity that contemporary methods could not. Advances in forensic science slowly began to offer possibilities. By the late 1970s and 1980s, fingerprint databases and rudimentary DNA analysis became available, but the physical items from 1949 had degraded in ways that limited immediate application. Nevertheless, Green kept the files alive, frequently revisiting them, imagining a scenario in which new techniques could finally align with old clues. Each review offered faint glimpses of hope, the notion that time might not only obscure truth, but also create the conditions for its eventual revelation. The case took on a life of its own within law enforcement circles. Retired officers, community historians, and even federal investigators occasionally revisited the case files. They analyzed witness statements for inconsistencies, cross-referenced names with subsequent criminal records, and considered patterns of behavior that might have been invisible to the original investigators. Each analysis was meticulous, but progress remained elusive. The trail had been broken too completely, leaving the mystery as intangible as a ghost, haunting the streets and memories of Jacksonville. For the Parker family, years of unanswered questions transformed grief into a quiet, simmering determination. Margaret attended vigils and wrote letters, never ceasing to hope that someday a clue might surface. Thomas continued his solitary walks along the old newspaper route, imagining Evelyn's laughter in the wind, retracing every step in his mind with obsessive care. Their resilience became legendary in the community, inspiring volunteers and reminding the town that the search for truth does not end with time, but with the courage and perseverance to endure. A breakthrough came unexpectedly in the mid-1990s, nearly 5 decades after Evelyn's disappearance. The local historical society, digitizing old town records and archive files, stumbled upon a series of overlooked documents, letters from itinerant workers reporting suspicious behavior near the cotton mill in 1949, and a set of detailed sketches by a volunteer searcher documenting footprints and impressions in soil and gravel. These materials were cross-referenced with Green's original notes and, remarkably, indicate a consistent pattern, a specific location near the abandoned railroad tracks that had been searched only superficially. The discovery did not immediately solve the case, but illuminated a path that investigators had not previously pursued with sufficient focus. In the early 2000s, forensic technology had advanced to a point where the preserved physical evidence, particularly the fibers from the broken strap and the remnants of the scuffed sneaker, could be subjected to sophisticated testing. Agencies outside Jacksonville were consulted, and a renewed investigation was launched. Specialists examined the materials under high-powered microscopes, analyzing fiber composition and wear patterns. The footprints, though long faded, were re-examined alongside historical photographs and witness sketches. Every preserved element, once considered insignificant or insufficient, was now a potential linchpin in a decades-old puzzle. This period marked a transition from a stagnant cold case to a carefully reconstructed investigation. The combination of archival research, modern forensic analysis, and a detailed review of witness accounts allowed investigators to narrow the field of potential suspects. It became evident that someone with intimate knowledge of Evelyn's route, timing, and habits had orchestrated her disappearance. The magnitude of that realization was staggering. Jacksonville had once dismissed these subtleties as incidental, but they were now the foundation for a potential resolution. During this cold case phase, the emotional toll on the Parker family remained profound. Margaret and Thomas, now elderly, followed every update, spoke with investigators, and participated in interviews, their memories sharpened by decades of longing and speculation. The town's collective memory had matured alongside them. Neighbors who were teenagers in 1949 recalled the panic and despair as vividly as if it were yesterday. The community's investment in the case had never waned, and this renewed investigative energy sparked a cautious optimism, a fragile sense that justice might finally be achievable. It was a delicate balance of persistence and patience. Investigators understood that decades of time had both obscured and preserved evidence. Memories faded, physical items deteriorated, and once promising leads had gone cold. Yet the preserved notes, the archive photographs, and the methodical documentation of Green and Ellis from 1949 provided the scaffolding upon which modern investigators could rebuild the narrative. Step by step, layer by layer, the cold case was reconstructed, each detail carefully measured, each connection scrutinized. By the end of this phase, Jacksonville had become a town of watchers and waiters. The streets, though no longer patrolled by search parties, retained an echo of vigilance. Community members checked on one another, shared recollections, and quietly hoped for closure. The Parker family remained steadfast, their grief transformed into endurance, their love for Evelyn unwavering. And beneath the surface, hidden in old files, preserved fibers and historical sketches, the evidence laid patiently, waiting for the moment when science, diligence, and timing would finally intersect to reveal the truth. The breakthrough came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it changed everything. In the summer of 2003, forensic analysts revisited the preserved fibers from Evelyn Parker's broken satchel. Using modern DNA extraction techniques, they were able to isolate a partial profile, a faint trace of biological material that had gone undetected in previous decades. The discovery sent shockwaves through Jacksonville's law enforcement, though no one yet knew the identity behind the profile. It was a ghostly fingerprint from the past, a thread that had survived the passage of 54 years, waiting to connect with the present. Detectives combed through historical records, cross-referencing names of local men who had been in proximity to Evelyn's newspaper route in 1949, focusing on those with criminal histories or suspicious behavior noted in Green and Ellis's meticulous notes. One name, Richard Dick Carver, kept resurfacing. He had been a local laborer, known to wander the outskirts of town, and sometimes observed near the cotton mill. While questioned briefly in 1949, he had never been detained due to lack of evidence. Now, with the DNA profile in hand, Carver became the prime focus of a renewed investigation. Law enforcement moved cautiously but with determination. Carver, by this time in the 70s, was living quietly in a nearby town, retired, and largely unknown outside his immediate circle. Officers tracked his movements, conducted surveillance, and prepared the case for an arrest that would need to withstand intense scrutiny. They obtained a warrant to collect a DNA sample directly from him, ensuring that the procedure would be thorough and legally sound. When the swab confirmed a match with the DNA extracted from the satchel fibers, investigators knew they had found their perpetrator. It was irrefutable. Evelyn Parker's disappearance, long shrouded in mystery, could finally be traced to one man. The arrest itself was quiet but shocking. Early one morning, a squad of officers arrived at Carver's modest home. He was cooperative, perhaps stunned by the realization that a crime committed more than half a century earlier had finally caught up with him. "I don't understand," he stammered when confronted with the evidence, eyes darting nervously as officers explained the DNA match and the historical investigation that had led them to him. For the community of Jacksonville, however, the moment was seismic. The man who had haunted their collective memory for decades, the shadow behind countless rumors and suspicions, was finally held accountable. News of the arrest spread rapidly. Local newspapers ran front-page headlines. Jacksonville cold case solved, arrest shocks community, and DNA links Richard Carver to 1949 disappearance. Residents were stunned. Some cried openly, others whispered in disbelief. For many, the arrest was bittersweet. A relief that the truth had been uncovered, but also a reminder of the decades lost, of the years of uncertainty, of the life that had been stolen. For the Parker family, the emotions were overwhelming. Margaret Parker, now frail but unbroken, wept openly, her hand trembling as she held the photograph of Evelyn she had carried for decades. Thomas Parker, eyes brimming with tears, simply nodded, the weight of years pressing down on him even as a measure of vindication finally took hold. And as the sun set over Jacksonville, casting long shadows across streets that had once been familiar and comforting, the town breathed again, not in forgetfulness, but in remembrance. Evelyn Parker's story, once suspended in uncertainty, had finally reached its conclusion. A truth that had lingered for more than 50 years now stood undeniable, etched into the hearts of those who had waited, watched, and refused to let silence prevail. The truth, long deferred, had finally arrived.